I don't know a single case where a Russian person adopted an American child.
My sister grew up in an orphanage, and I got to grow up in America.
The categories of disabilities in Russia are a bit different than in the United States. It really ties to how much money you get from the government.
Medical care that they get in the orphanages, especially back in the day, just wasn't sufficient enough to...
Hi, welcome to Refugee from Russia podcast. I hope you're doing well. I traveled across the United States to meet with people who immigrated to America from Russia to hear their stories. Now, this wasn't an easy task and my team faced a lot of challenges. I do hope that you enjoy this new series because we really worked very hard on this. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. So today I have a guest. His name is Victor. Adopted at 8 months. Do you remember anything of your life in Russia? Probably not, right?
Absolutely not. It's all an estimation of what it would have been like. But I do know my birth family. I met them when I was 21 years old. So I'm aware of my family's history, my family's social status now, their whereabouts, and essentially the conditions that I was born into. So I know a lot about my life in Russia, but I have no lived experience.
I watched 2 of the interviews that you've already given on your story. And obviously, I looked at some of the comments while I was watching the interview. And there were a couple very interesting ones that I wanted to get your reaction on. Ready? Okay. There is one, I will say this in Russian, then translate into English. Я не знаю ни единого случая, когда россияне усыновили хоть одного американца. I don't know a single case where a Russian person adopted an American child.
That is most likely, I don't know if it's not ever happened, but it is not popular for Russians to adopt Americans. And that's just the difference between our economic states. A lot of Russians don't adopt in general, and they definitely don't adopt Americans. But a lot of Americans adopt from different cultures. The reason why I was adopted from Russia by an American family is because their heritage is of Ukrainian, Russian, Polish ethnicity. So they wanted a child that looked like them and was of the same ethnicity. So that's probably why a lot of other American families do the same thing, presuming they're Caucasian or white.
Another comment that got 828 likes.
Oh my God.
It's a pretty long one, so let me read it in Russian first.
Sure.
Как разнятся дети? Одну воспитал интернат, и сразу видно по ней, насколько ее развитие. И другого ребенка воспитали любящий родитель, дали образование и прогресс на лицо. Умный, развитый, совершенно нормальный парень. So, I will try my best. I am obviously not an interpreter, but I'll try my best. How different are the children? One was educated by the orphanage, and you can tell immediately how she was developed or how she got developed. The other child grew up in a loving family with loving parents who gave him education, and you can see the results of that. Smart, developed, absolutely, I guess they say normal guy, but normal can have
healthy
guy. I think they're comparing you and your sister in this comment.
They are, and actually I saw a lot of comments in there comparing our physical and mental condition. You can tell that she talks slow, apparently, especially for Russian, to my knowledge, that there's like this, maybe there's a stereotype about Russians that live in like the rural areas, that they're less educated. A lot of people were criticizing my sister's speech, saying that she doesn't speak very educated, like she was educated properly. And then she also has viewpoints that a lot of people that are more, Western leaning are going to disagree with. So they dismiss her as someone who's uneducated. She was, to my knowledge, never went to college. My sister grew up in an orphanage, and I got to grow up in America, which is why I was interested in speaking on something like this, where I think that you're most likely going to have a lot of guests that are just a lot more Russian in demeanor, a lot more have a lot more experiences living in Russia, whereas me, I have a direct bloodline to it, but I grew up here in America. I consider myself a New Yorker. Is like the first identity that I operate as. But life is complex. I have my identity as a Russian, as an American, and then my adoptive family being part Russian and Ukrainian, but mainly of Ukrainian ethnicity. I identify with all of that all at once. So for me, it's just different. I mean, I have like this American demeanor. I speak like a New Yorker. I have a very fluent accent, or very strong New York accent. But my sister, she didn't grow up with the proper education. She didn't get to grow up going to college or anything like that. So a lot of people were criticizing her.
Why do you think they were criticizing her?
Well, I think there's a lot of stuff with her political viewpoints. She was making comments that a lot of people weren't agreeing with.
There's another comment here. I'll say it in Russian first. Очень понравился парень из Америки. Он вырос чудесным человеком. Хорошо, что его жизнь сложилась таким образом. I really like the guy from America. He grew up to be a wonderful person. It's good that his life turned out to be this way.
That's nice. That's nice to hear. I actually think that my main goal of doing any work in regards to adoption or even in regards to the Russian part of my life, an adoptive part of my life, is to just show people a positive version of the story. There's a lot of cases which people were commenting on children being adopted into abusive households or being kidnapped.
From Russia to America.
From Russia to America. But in many cases, there's a lot of negativity around Russia, around adoption. There's a lot of this like idea that if you give up a kid and they grow up in an orphanage, they will end up with a horrible life. So for me to be one of the many cases that isn't necessarily that, I found it to be helpful, like a healing experience to myself, but also a productive experience for other people to show a positive viewpoint. I spoke in that interview about how I was thinking about the next generation and how I want to...
There was a comment about that as well. Someone was saying like showing the contrast between how you were speaking about the future, like that next generation.
I must have missed that. I tried to read as many comments as possible. I'll tell you this about that interview.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
It says, it's just basically, I think, again, comparing you and your sister. It says, sister, and in quotes, everything is good. We have peaceful sky. Nothing flew to us. She means the rockets from Ukraine. I can eat, I can sleep, everything is good. And then you're thinking, it says, in quotes, I really think a lot about the next generation, support my nieces and nephews. I have a lot of opportunities to break this vicious cycle, get rid of the poverty, alcoholism, psychological problems, and problems with health. And then he says, feel the difference in mentality.
Yeah. Again, I maybe it's my role as her brother to step up for my sister and say that she's not someone that's ignorant to the plight that's happening across the border. But I will say that there's definitely a difference in delivery where she almost sounds like she's selfish. Like, I think a lot of people are trying to frame her like she's this one person. And this is the beauty of filmmaking, is you can actually change the perspective of what she's saying and cut it a certain way. Because I said this was a 2-hour interview. I said a lot more than what made it to screen. And the same thing with her. I will give her the benefit of the doubt that she probably said some things that didn't get cut properly. They call it cherry picking in terms of like news and whatnot. I'm sure you're aware if you ever did any like political science class. They talk about that media will cut out certain chunks.
It's amazing. Your experience actually is helping you understand this interview better as a filmmaker yourself. I didn't think about that part.
Yeah, and also probably the other way around. Me being a filmmaker, helping me be able to pick apart the documentary for what it is. I knew going into that interview that it was going to be one. They wanted to talk about politics. They actually asked me a lot more political questions than I was anticipating. I thought it was going to be more about adoption. Because usually the platform that I use in terms of filmmaking is to talk about adoption or diasporas rather than politics and what this politician did and what that I even made a point in that documentary to say, and I spoke a lot more elaborately, which was like that creating this isolation between America and Russia is what causes most of the conflict that we see. And unfortunately, the media system that we live in here in America and in Russia as well, media benefits off of like politically charged headlines. So the more that we see that there's stuff about the war, then the more money they're going to make. So we only see a certain viewpoint of it. And that even happened in the documentary. They want to talk more about politics, where I want to talk more about, adoption and family connection despite negative things. I'm more of an optimist. And I also think that's a big thing between me and my more Russian counterparts, people that were raised in Russia, where they have more of a negative outlook on life. Where me, I'm trying to look for the benefits of things, trying to look for the optimist side of things.
There was an excellent comment that I also felt was warranted. It's about your sister. It's a very long one. I will try to translate it right away. So it goes like this. Everyone is praising the guy from America, but I am in awe of Alexandra, who grew up in more brutal conditions, orphanage conditions, and she took on herself the responsibility of taking care after or watching after the sick brother, having no family support. She deserves more respect, more admiration. She's done a good job. She has a kind heart. All of I think the person is referring, the characters of the documentary, all of them did a good job. But only the ones with the strongest soul, she's referring to Alexandra, would be able to take upon themselves the responsibility of taking care of a person who has mental health issues. Also, I found this really, really interesting. She commented, and because of her, the kids did not lose connection with the mother.
That is my favorite comment that you brought up, and that's very much on how I feel. I think that if anyone else was put in the position that Sasha Alexandra was put in, they would break. Russia in 1996, that's when I was born. Russia in the mid-90s was falling apart. It's indescribable. You can't even describe the way how horrible it was at that time. And for her to be an orphan at that time in the late 90s, early 2000s, to grow up without a mom who was an alcoholic and neglectful / abusive, and then to be forced into an orphanage, grow up to age 16, 17, to get kicked out, and she pursued college. She wanted to be a painter. She wanted to learn painting. I don't really know if she meant painting as an artist or painting as a trade. I went with a translator when I went to Russia to meet my family, and I'll speak more about that. But essentially, she pursued college, but she also had a lot of trauma being an orphan, that she had what in America, especially with like millennials and Gen Z, they'll call it trauma bonding. My sister gravitated clearly towards men who also had trauma, who maybe leaned on drugs and alcohol to control their own emotions, which just leads to a rough life. So my sister was a single mom raising 2 children from different fathers. Both are Uzbek, coincidentally. Maybe it's just because it's the geography of my home city to the Central Asia. But she is a really strong woman. And that was my impression when I first spoke to her 8 years ago. I first contacted her when I was...
Wow, it was that long ago.
20 years. Yeah, I went in 2017. I went in 2017 to Russia. And I will speak more about that in a minute. But I'm sure you're kind of aware by watching those docs. But I'll speak more about it for the podcast's sake. I really think that my biological sister, Sasha, out of my whole family, is the strongest person, even outside of me, because of what she had to go through. Now, I grew up with the idea of what it could have been like. If I was still there now, I would probably be in the army, right? Something of that nature. I would probably have a much different life.
You would be probably fighting in Ukraine right now on Russia's behalf.
Most likely.
Highly likely.
And that's also why, for me, I have to operate with the idea of like, optimism all the time, which can even be its own issue. Because even though I might not be feeling so hot one day, there's this weight on my shoulders that life could have been a whole lot different, a whole lot worse. And now I'm forcing myself to be productive, which is its own response to what happened, because I'm adopted and now I'm saved. But I have to live this life, my whole life like this, which I love. And also it's complex. At times I don't really wish that upon myself. But yeah, my sister I find to be really strong, especially with the fact that we have our brother, Dima, has mental problems and it's undiagnosed.
She takes him on vacation every year.
Yeah, she takes him on vacation every year for about a month.
I wish I could interview your sister, to be honest. I speak Russian. And I think I already have so much admiration for her, for what she went through and what she's been doing and taking care of the kids and taking care of the sick brother.
And he's living in what the translation is
Internat. Yeah. I remember watching the documentary and she mentions he has type 2 disability, which maybe we can speak about this a little more, but the categories of disabilities in Russia are a bit different than in the United States. I think they have, I would say, disability category really ties to how much money you get from the government. And so sometimes some of the, for example, difficult cases don't get the same category and unfortunately don't get the same support. And so it's kind of hard to say, like, after watching the documentary, what exactly he has as far as mental issue. But I remembered it was category 2.
I don't know what he has because the diagnosis is so vague. Also, I think that the medical care that they get in the orphanages, especially back in the day, just wasn't sufficient enough to treat whatever he has at the young age it needed to be treated. And I also think that just the doctors kind of pass on somebody. And what I mean by passing on him is just, they look at him and say, there's something wrong with him, but just send him off. They don't really look at him, or they don't really look at people like that.
Especially back then, the mental health as a whole, I think, was highly stigmatized. And it's almost like, oh, I wish not to know what's the issue with him. And I know we started with the comments. I have a little bit background into what you went through and your story. If you were to walk into the room with people that don't know you, but would like to know you, how would you share your story? Say, how much would you share if you really want them to connect with you and know about you?
Well, the answer is obviously subjective, because if I'm around more people that are, it actually is it's going to be very subjective. I have been in spaces here in America, especially New York, Miami, highly concentrated areas of Ukrainian people. So sharing that I'm Russian is very complex. And I have to share it from an angle that might be more digestible to people, which I'm aware of, and I understand it needs to be handled with care, especially at a time of now. And in those cases, I do find myself sharing more about, like, my adoptive family being Ukrainian. However, if I was with a lot of Russians, maybe I might be like what they call like code switching, shifting my the way I deliver that explanation. But if I'm just talking to New Yorkers, Americans, or whatever, I usually do tell people I'm Russian, because I think that, one, it's something I'm proud of, regardless of what's going on. I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of my family, Sasha, my mom. I'm proud of my family for overcoming poverty as much as they have, because at its core, that's what my birth family is, right? So when I introduce myself to a room full of people that I've never met before, I'll tell them my name is Victor, or Vitya, which is my stage name that I go by in film and in music, which is, to my knowledge, the nickname you give your little brother named Victor is Vitya. And I always love that, because it's like I didn't get to grow up with that, so I wanted to embrace it. So that's why I chose that. But I'll introduce myself as my name, and a lot of people automatically, if they hear Vitya, they always think it's like Italian or something. And
Italian?
Yeah, but it sounds, to an American, it sounds like you have to understand the Western brain. There's only, it's very rugged. it's very rugged. You know, there's only like one way of thinking. Oh, it sounds like a luxury brand, and maybe I'll make a luxury brand named Vitya. That'd
I think
be cool.
you should.
Yeah, why not?
I think you
But
should.
the point is like they'll be like, oh, where's that from? And I'll say, you know, I'm from Russia. With certain people, if I'm not comfortable, I will admit, if I'm not comfortable with somebody, I'm not really going to share much at all. I'll tell them my name, but I'll just let them think I'm just the next guy because I don't want that type of attention. Some people have very charged agendas. Some people are very rough. And not that I can't stick up for myself, not that I can't have that conversation, but is it really in anyone's best interest to open up that door at that moment, especially in a professional atmosphere if I'm at a networking event? But I will say, all that being said, there are people that are, you know, people of color, for instance, that don't get to hide their ethnicity. Like I can hide that I'm Russian anytime I want because I'm a white passing American with a New York accent. No one's going to think a second thought. But because of that, I try my best to introduce myself. I am a Russian American and I was adopted because those are the two main facts about me is that I was born in Russia and I was adopted. That's my identity. And that's who I am and how my life changed and what my mission is. And for me, I will say I'm very grateful because I have a purpose in my life and that's built off of my origin. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on who I'm talking to. I mean, I just met you, and because of who you are, I'm willing to share this much information. But if you were Tom walking down the street, hi. I don't need to give you this much information about my life. I am also just careful about sharing my information with strangers like that, like you should be.
Yeah.
You know.
So for anyone who doesn't know, I will try to briefly summarize your story. We already talked a little bit about you being adopted. You were adopted at 8 months old to a wonderful family that already had someone adopted at that time, Brian, that's your brother. And they were looking to adopt, I believe, a daughter, right, at that time, and they were having a hard time doing that. And then they adopted you. And in the beginning, they had a bit of a hard time figuring out if you had any mental health issues. I think when I was listening to that part, I thought to myself, well, the kids in Russia are not as smiley, though. Like, you can come across a child in Russia being super shy, super, reserved, and you might think, oh, are they okay? But, like, in general, like, kids, especially with strangers or with cameras at that time, you have to remember, like, growing up in a poor family, you don't have a phone. I got my computer when I was 15 for the first time, right? So that was an interesting thought I had, like he just wasn't smiling. I think that's like a normal thing for kids in Russia. You work in a really, really interesting industry where you tell stories and you help people with telling stories as well. I want to know personally, because I didn't get enough information on that. When did you start thinking, oh, I need to know about my family in Russia? Like, or did you ever at any point feel like I'm a foreigner here and that's why, therefore, I have to start looking for my family?
The first part of that answer is a question that you didn't ask, which is, when did I find out I was adopted? Which is usually a question I get all the time. The answer is I never knew that I wasn't adopted. I was never told that I wasn't adopted. I was born, adopted, and as early as my memories go back, as the second I was speaking, I knew that I was adopted because my adoptive family told me, this is your story. I think that's impressive that they did that. There are some stories that kids will find out at the 16th birthday that they're adopted, and it ruins their life.
I actually interviewed, I'm sorry to interrupt. I interviewed a girl in Los Angeles who was adopted as well. And at the age of 11, unfortunately, she was not allowed to speak Russian. And as I was reading and listening the stories, documentaries about your story, I thought, wow, like here, one example where your identity was accepted and embraced by your family. And there's another example where the family was trying to wipe out her identity completely.
Wow.
So yeah, that episode is coming out soon.
That's
I think
part of this?
It's part of my podcast. Her name is Violetta. I will be posting her interview soon. Yeah.
the more I hear other people's stories, and I'm shown how lucky I am, and I embrace it. I don't downplay my luck, but I also won't say that there's not a dark side to this.
Of course.
Like, there's a very complex thing. I mean, I'm Russian. Like, it's like a curse word in America. First of all, it's like how many movies are about the mafia or the Russian communists, whatever it is. They, you know, it's a bad word here. So I'm aware of how lucky I am. I'm sorry for that person. But going back to the stories that I never not knew, there was never a moment that I didn't know that I was adopted. So there was growing up, I had like a green folder that my parents gave me.
Oh, wow.
That was the documents in Cyrillic, in Russian, of my medical history and the release papers that Yelena, which is my mother, signed, relinquishing her care of me, which is like the term they use for I'm giving this kid up to be an orphan. Relinquishing her custody. So I grew up with having this folder in my house. And I would read it from time to time, and I couldn't read Russian, but there were English parts, and I would also like look at, this is like in the early 2000s, you didn't have the capability of taking a picture of text and translating it. I would find like a keyboard on like the internet of like Cyrillic and type in the letters and try my best to translate it myself. And it was always in like broken English, but I gathered the information that it was, you know, my mother had a couple of children already. It didn't say how many. Maybe it said she had 3, which is true. But it said, you know, my husband drinks, we don't have a job, and I need to give up the care of the kid. So I always knew that. I always knew my mom's name was Elena or Yelena. Elena in English, I guess.
Yeah.
I always knew that I was from Krasnodar. I always knew that I was adopted at 8 months old. And funny enough, you know, we haven't talked much about it, but like my adoptive family, interestingly enough, has a lot of ties to Russia as well. And one thing that I always found really funny is that my adoptive father's birthday is the day that I was adopted. So he adopted me on his birthday. So I always give him the joke that like I was his best birthday present.
Aww,
you know.
that's really sweet.
And we're very close. You know, I'm actually very close with my family, especially now as an adult, seeing the reality of the world and, you know, just imagining what life would be like for me if I were to adopt a child in such a crazy situation. One thing about adoptees is that their parents never really get the praise they deserve. Like I'm doing this podcast right now, but there's not a you know, my mom's not doing a podcast about how she adopted a child. She flew in 1997 to Moscow, then a connecting flight to Krasnodar, which she described as like smelling like just like a farm. Like both my parents, my mom and my dad, flew all the way to this foreign country in the mid-90s after the Soviet Union collapsed, and waited in an airport and had to do all this crazy legal stuff and pay a bunch of money to adopt a child they've never met and bring them back to the States. I mean, like, and then I get all the credit. I got to say that's really funny itself. But
Yeah.
so I do want to stay on track. I grew up knowing my history. And then I had a lot of anger when I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, like most kids are, you know, you're angsty, you want to grow up, you don't want to be like a young child anymore. You want to have your own rights, drive, whatever the things you want to do are. But I felt that a lot more intensely because I had a lot of anger towards my birth mother. As like a young adult, well, as a teenager and a young adult, I had a lot of anger of like, why didn't this woman just keep me? Why couldn't I just live with my mom? Why did I have to get rejected? You know, I had this feeling of abandonment. And to be honest with you, it really got in my way a lot in terms of like feeling like I could trust people, feeling like I could make friends, self-esteem. And that type of feeling made me feel very lost. But then when I was somewhere in late high school, just about to graduate college, it's not like I had a life-changing experience, but my perspective changed. Maybe it was when around the time I started going to college, I just decided that, what has been missing, this feeling of emptiness, has been myself. And I felt like I was missing a part of my identity, which at that time, I was going by my given name, Zachary. And what was missing was the alternate part of me, which is Victor. And not that I'm like a schizophrenic and have multiple personalities, but more in the fact that I have dual identities. I am a Russian American hyphenated. It's two things in one. And that's when around 18, the short answer is around 18 is when I started getting really into my culture. That was 18 years that I was not connected with really who I am. And over the past 10 years, I'm 28 now, I've been progressively more and more intertwined with my culture, for better and worse. There's a lot of beautiful things about Russia and a lot of negative things. I've studied the books. I've watched the 8-hour Romanov video about the history of Russia from 800 to now and all the complexities. And a lot of it's ugly and a lot of it's beautiful. And again, going back to what you were asking, like, or comparing how I feel about the future versus how my sister feels about the future, I think that there's a future for Russia. This is completely off topic, but I do think that there's a future for Russia. And I think I would like to discuss that when we have a moment.
I grew up in Russia. I lived there almost my whole life. And I'm interviewing you, so I'm a bit torn between having a conversation versus keeping the interviewer hat on. So I want to take it off for a little bit, if you don't mind. There's a couple of things that you said that I wanted to share my perspective on. One of those things you said about your mom and feeling angry at that time as a teenager. My mind immediately went to the time that my parents lived in the 90s. It was practically impossible to have a child and make that child survive, let alone 2, 3.
I'm glad that you are coming from like the empathetic view versus the Russian view that you're saying, where like, how dare you say you were mad at your mom? Look at what she was going through. And I really, as I grew up, I recognize what my mom went through, and that's why I found the reaction to just the videos and other interviews I've done being like, how dare your family do this and that, and they're brainwashed by propaganda and all this stuff. It's like, they might be, but that's not the problem. Like they live in like a village, and they don't live in like the city center. They're not from Moscow. They're not established people. My family is an impoverished family from the middle of nowhere in Russia. That's pretty much the thing. And I visited my hometown, my home block, and the house that I used to live in was knocked down and replaced by another building. But I saw a neighboring house, and I took a photo of it. And I look at that photo, and I imagine living here with 3 siblings. And mind you, we haven't even spoke about my other sibling.
You have 3, right?
Yulia. My eldest sister, she's nowhere to be found.
No way.
She's nowhere to be found because she apparently had a child, and I know the child. This is my nephew. I've met my nephew, but I've never met his mom, my sister. She had him, and apparently she went crazy and ended up in a mental institute somewhere far north.
That's another topic in itself.
Yeah,
because
like it's its own thing. But
she might have just had struggled with postpartum, and they
and they just throw them in a
Oh wow.
Yeah, it is its own thing. But I guess what I'm saying is going from the mentality of being a teenager and saying, "Oh, I'm angry at my upbringing. How dare my mom abandon me as a child?" I'll say this. I think part of that mentality I got from my adoptive brother, who was also adopted. Now he's an American. He was born in Pennsylvania and then adopted in New York. He wasn't a far fetch. Not to say his backstory isn't also complicated, but I think that he has a lot more Western view of like, if you give up a kid, you're a bad person, like this type of view. But in Russia, like you're explaining, this is just the reality that someone can't take care of a kid because especially in the 90s, there was people were taking metal off of buildings to scrap for money. Like there's crazy stories. You had a second question, which was after it was, you asked, when did I want to learn more about my culture? But what was the second part of that question?
I think the other part was you wanting to learn about your culture. Was it a result of feeling like a foreigner or not accepted? That's why you were seeking that.
Yeah, in an interesting way, I think that was more internalized than externalized. Like, and what I mean by that is I don't think many people treated me like I was a foreigner, but I definitely didn't feel like an American. There's this thing that happens in the head of somebody that immigrates to a country, especially at a young age, that you are, in case a third culture person, a third culture child, your first culture being your native culture, your second culture being the country you immigrated to, but then you're not really either or. You're this third thing in the middle. That's why they call it that. And that's how I've always felt. And now I get to embrace it more as an adult, especially just with the freedoms that I have as an adult in America, having enough capital to be able to move around where I need to and be able to tell these stories, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea of me even getting to tell other people's stories or connect people and help them tell stories is because I've had to understand mine. And the craziest thing about all of it is that I'm still learning. You know, I'm still learning as an adoptee. I've said this in other interviews, like your journey is lifelong. For some people, they might find out they're adopted, research their family, find out they're dead, and never want to learn another thing, or they're adopted and they never want to turn back. But for some people like myself, I don't even know our genealogy. And that's something I'd really like to know because I've researched into the last name Chabanov, and I've learned that it is a Caucasian word for shepherd, like a sheep herder. I don't remember the breakdown of how the word translates.
Chaban.
Right.
That's the root word.
Right, and that is
It's a shepherd.
Shepherd, yeah. So I'm pretty sure I'm confident that my mother's ethnicity is Russian. And that's what my sister calls herself, and that's what our family is. But I don't think that's its ethnic roots and it's our genealogy. And I'd like to learn more about that. So that's what I'm saying is my journey is more of a lifelong journey because I have yet to even cross to that boundary of maybe taking a DNA test of some sort. There's people that do comprehensive DNA tests where you don't just get the results. So you're part this. No, it's your family's lineage, the root word of like your last name. Maybe sometimes there's records of immigration of them going from one place to another because unless we're Circassian, we're most likely not from Krasnodar. We're either from Moscow or something like that, or something like Dagestan too. I don't know. I really don't know. And I'd like to know more. And because of that mystery, I've decided to research as much about the Caucasus ethnicities as possible, but it's a very long list.
Yeah, it is.
And it's also very complex. And it's like opening up Pandora's box. Once you open that, it's so much to learn about. And there's also, unfortunately, limited resources. There's very limited resources on Caucasian history. And it's so funny because it's actually one of the most broadly used terms on Earth, especially in the English language, is Caucasian, and nobody knows where it's from.
Yeah.
Caucasian, as you know, is from the Caucasus, and this is what people of Western European descent want to call themselves because they thought that Caucasian women were very beautiful. And it's this way of like kind of taking one's culture and transforming it into another way to divide people by race.
I mean, I personally feel as Caucasian that it's completely wiping out my heritage
Right.
in the Western world, because this is where we speak English.
Mm-hmm.
No one think of us when they say Caucasian,
Yeah.
and they think of white people.
They
So
don't speak
kind of
English
funny
in the
because
Caucasus. Yeah.
exactly in the Caucasus though, we were at maybe even till today, but up until a certain point, we were called darkies, and Russians are the white ones.
Right.
I will tell you a true story. I found out that I'm white. Some people don't believe this, and I completely understand why. But I grew up in a different environment, in a different world. So I found out that I'm racially white when I was 19, when I moved to America. Because growing up as a non-Russian, that's a term widely used in Russia, не русская, that means I am not ethnically Russian, therefore I am darker. So there was a very common term used, churka. I mean, you might have heard that. Also a slur used for people who are darker than Russian people. So I would love the word Caucasian to be used properly to describe the essentially indigenous people of the Caucasus.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of fun questions for you. You ready? Don't think too much about the answers. Rather than another question, finish a sentence. I wish I...
Could go back to Russia. This is easy one for me.
It's interesting that I...
I'm still here.
in New York or in America?
Just alive. Just given all the trials and tribulations that I could have ended up in.
I regret that I...
I guess I regret that I don't talk to my family more.
I learned that I
learned that I am a strong person.
I never expected that I
never expected that I would change my name back to Victor. That's something that I never thought of. It's something that came to me. Yeah.
I'm proud that
I'm proud that I'm doing what I'm doing.
I used to believe that but now
I used to believe that I was hopeless. I used to believe that I wouldn't be able to accomplish much because my family is a bunch of failures and that I would be a failure too. But I've proven myself wrong.
Yeah. Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you for
Appreciate
having
it.
me.
Thank you so much for watching today's video. I appreciate that. If you think it's worth sharing, please share, like it, and subscribe. It's free, it's quick, it's easy, and it really helps the algorithm. By the way, if you're interested in sharing your story about how you came to the United States from Russia or ex-USSR countries, leave me a comment or send me an email at refugeefromrussiapodcast@gmail.com.